It's now time for Fersan in the Field, Real Issues, Real Solutions, brought to you by Newport-Fersan, Jamaica. And joining us this morning, Melvin Henry, Technical Manager. And this morning, Melvin comes to us to talk about no pollen, no profit, the science behind fruit size and quality. Good morning, Melvin. How are you?
Good morning, Altia. Good morning to our listeners. I'm doing great.
Good to have you on with us. So, Melvin, I'm fascinated, by this title, No Pollen, No Profit, the science behind fruit size and quality. What caused you to want to go down this road?
Okay, so as per usual, at Newport-Fersan, and the technical department is that I lead is entrusted with the responsibility of identifying what are classified as challenges that our farmers face from time to time, and to see how best with our knowledge, our expertise, we can intervene to reduce or totally eliminate those said challenges that from time to time affect our farmers. This one in particular, the issue of pollen formation and the quality of pollen is one that is common. And as we go further into the discussion, you will see that we really want to look at some of the resonating common challenges that farmers can well identify with from time to time. And therefore, the objective is to see how best we can together take steps to, as I said before, eliminate or reduce the negative impact of those said challenges.
All right, so really very important. All right, so let us just start first of all with the farmers themselves and how it is that they take a look at things. I know, for example, most farmers are of the view that fruit size depends mainly on fertilizer application. Is this true though, Melvin?
Partially. So once it's not entirely, it means that something is missing. So as you rightly said, farmers often invest heavily in fertilizers, irrigation systems, pesticides, yet a large number of our farmers are unaware that a tiny grain of pollen can determine whether a crop becomes a profitable harvest or a disappointing yield. And the reality is simple. As the topic says, no pollen, no profit. And with that said, the major objective is really to uncover how the successful pollen formation, the pollination process, in conjunction, in addition to what you mentioned just now, proper crop nutrition, environmental conditions, all influence the fruit size, quality, yield, and ultimately what makes the farmer happy, and that is the return on investment, their income. So, in reality, nutrition plays, of course, a critical role. But every fruit that we have is actually starts from a flower, and before a flower can produce a fruit, viable pollens must be produced and transferred, thereby causing pollination. After that, you have fertilization, yes, and without that, and if that process fails, some of the common things that farmers are normally seeing in the field is, one, you'll have a poor fruit set. So you have that transition being poorer than it should. Misshapen fruit. So we're talking deformities to fruit. It's something that we see from time to time and often too common in crops like sweet pepper, tomato, cucumbers, watermelon, you name it, corn. You'll see what we call misshapen fruits. You'll have smaller fruits. You'll have fruits, depending on the fruit in question, that you have sections that are hollow. So there's a gap, there's an empty space inside. You'll also have premature dropping of your fruit.
Mm-hmm.
That could happen if it is that the pollen quality and the pollination process
in fact, I do find these days, Melvin, that we get a lot of those kinds of questions from listeners about how to deal with fruit and flower fall. So there seems to be a lot of that happening.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and as I said before, it is caused by several factors at play. But the more we are aware of the factors that contribute to this condition, then the better we are in terms of our response to prevent them happening as far as we can. And I dare say that there are quite a number of steps that are ignored from time to time in the production process, and as a result, this is more common than it really should be. And that's the objective this morning, to see how best together we can overall and stem those unfortunate situations.
All right. So you mentioned pollen and pollination. Let me start with pollen. What is pollen?
Okay. Depending on where you grew up in Jamaica, because you can find a significant difference between a child growing up in St. Elizabeth versus a child growing up in St. Mary, where I am from. And even in our earliest science classes, one of the first flowers that was used to educate us was that of the hibiscus, because a lot of things are very clear.
I could have called that, and Derek could have called that too. In fact, we had to draw the hibiscus.
Exactly. So I'm going to use it as an example, and then I'll transition to a crop. So think of the pollen as that delivery mechanism that it's a male component, reproductive part of the flower. So you need to have the male coming together with the female in order for you to produce. So that is where you have fertilization. So the male carries a lot of information, and the pollen grain is that male component that without it, nothing else happened in terms of fruit development. Now, if you look at the hibiscus flower, they're close towards the top, not the extreme top. Around the side of that pink tube, there are some little things sticking off to the side, right around. And if you touch them, it has this yellow color, very fine. Those are actually the pollen, right? So those are actually the male component of the whole process. If you look at corn, at the extreme top of the corn plant, where you have the tassel, that is where the pollen grains are produced. Those pollen grains produced at the top, and God didn't make any mistake, actually falls through gravity or with the assistance of pollinators to the silk that comes out from the corn itself. So each of those silk out there is actually connected to one grain of corn. If it is that you didn't have enough pollen moving from that tassel to an individual sting, you have a poorly developed corn grain. So when you have a corn that sometimes you'll notice that even along the side, stretching from the bottom to the top of the corn cob, you'll see a gap. It's a situation where something went wrong with that female tube that runs, that silk that runs in that vicinity. So as a result, if adequate amount of pollens are transferred to those silks, then you have problems in terms of the quality of the produce that is developed. All right? So that is essentially the pollen. And for different crops, it comes in different ways. And as we go further, you'll see when we look at crops like pumpkin and cucumbers, how it's sort of different. But that's essentially what is the trigger for fruit development.
Okay. And so then when we talk about the whole issue of pollination, I wonder whether or not the irregular shaped, let us start with cucurbits. You mentioned corn, but I want to touch on cucurbits a little bit. Those irregular shaped watermelons, cucumbers, pumpkin, squash, is this linked to any issue with pollination?
Definitely. Oftentimes that is the sole culprit. Let us put it that way. So when you have, as you rightly said, those, whether you want to call them irregular shapes, and farmers are always concerned from very early in the game about them, in watermelon, cucumbers, you name it, because it comes to bear on the overall quality. And once you're seeing that, it is often, always, 99.9% of the time, it simply means that the quality of that produce will be compromised and the size. All right, so essentially what happens is, let's look at watermelon. Watermelon is kind of a unique because it has two separate flowers, a male flower and a female flower. The male flower normally emerges a couple of days before the female because it must be out, mature, and be ready for the female flower that emerges later. The female flower only has a very small window to accept pollen. So if you look at the melon, that melon flower that comes out with the tiny melon behind the flower is actually the female flower. Now that flower remains open for an average 24 hours. So if enough pollen is not transferred from the male flower to the female flower, what you'll have happen, oftentimes if it is inadequate within days, you'll notice that that small melon falls off the plant. So you need to have adequate transfer from the male to the female to determine the quality, the size, and the rate at which that melon ultimately develops. And oftentimes, as you rightly said, Alfio, when you start to see those poorly shaped melon cucumbers in the field, where one side is growing and the other isn't, it's because there was inadequate pollination or the quality of pollen produced in the first place, despite it being transferred to the female, was not of the highest quality. And as a result of that, you start to see those sort of a defect, and that ultimately affects the bottom line of the farmer, which is his return on investment.
All right. We're taking the break for the news and the weather. And when we come back, we will pick up on this issue. I believe it is very important what we're talking about this morning. No pollen, no profit. The science behind fruit size and quality. And Melvin Henry, Technical Manager, Newport-Fersan, will join us after the news and weather. We are moving now into the final segment of Farm Talk for today. And this morning we're discussing no pollen, no profit, the science behind fruit size and quality. Melvin Henry, Technical Manager, Newport-Fersan, is with us. So, Melvin, Paula Ann has the best tasting basil in the country. Do you think that the fact that she has been able to produce the best tasting basil has to do with the pollinators that she has at her yard?
That approximately 90% or more of our agricultural crops or crops that we derive food from globally actually relies on pollination. Right? But there is that percentage that it is neither here nor there. It is only in cases where we're actually producing seeds that pollination becomes important. So, for example, if you look at pineapple, despite the fact that pineapple produces multiple flowers, because in reality you have multiple flowers, multiple fruits or fruitlets. So those little black stuff that you see at the side when you peel, it's actually an indication of an individual fruit or fruitlet coming together to make a composite. In the case of pineapple, there's no need for you to have pollination to develop a quality pineapple fruit. The process is a different one, and we can discuss that at another time. But where basil is concerned, because largely what you're actually relying on in terms of the part is the foliage, and pretty much like, for example, onions again, it's actually the development of the vegetative part that is, but if you're talking about successive generation, we're actually getting to seed and the quality of the seed, then that process becomes important.
All right, excellent. So at least now we know that she's doing something right or hitting all of the right markers. All right, so what determines overall if pollen is of high quality? Is there anything specific that determines that?
There are several things that determine the quality of our pollen. And the first one is the one that is heavily our focus, and we spend time being expert at, is actually plant nutrition. The mother plant must be adequately nourished in order for you to have the development of quality pollen. Now, I'm going to make mention of a few nutrient elements that some persons might be hearing them for the first time. So it's always the focus on NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, which, yes, are required in comparatively larger quantities to these that I'm going to mention. So when we talk about boron, boron is often regarded as the pollination nutrient, and the reason it's tied directly to its function. It is important in pollen formation, and not only the formation, but the viability of the pollen. So it's one thing to have a pollen developed, but is that pollen viable, meaning is it able to, in its transfer of pollination, transfer the genetic material required for the development of the fruit. So you could have a faulty pollen being developed if boron is absent. You have the tube that once the pollination takes place, there's actually a tube, and it is visible in the example I used earlier with corn. So there is that tube that goes down the silk to the corn grain where fertilization takes place, and then you have that development. If you do not have adequate pollen, boron, then that tube will not grow as efficiently as it should, and therefore you're going to have poor fruit set. So you're going to have flower abortion, poor fruit set, and you're going to have misapple fruit, as we discussed earlier, if boron is inadequate. Let's look at zinc. There's a lot of discussion as it relates to the health of males surrounding zinc and the role it plays in our health. In a similar fashion for plants, the male component of the reproductive process, which is the pollen grains, zinc is critical for the production of the hormones responsible for flower development. So if you have a deficiency, you're going to have a reduction in pollen production, and you're going to have poor fertility. So you could actually have pollens that are developed, but they are infertile. I took the opportunity, Althea, to look at some samples that came back from the lab last week, and I analyzed 22 samples that returned. Of the 22 samples that returned from the lab, 16 of them showed that zinc was deficient in the soil. That is 73%. Boron, 20 of them showed that if there was no attention paid to boron in the plant nutrition process, you're going to have serious issues in terms of pollen formation and ultimately what comes out in terms of fruit development. That is 20 out of 22, that is 91%. So therein lies the issue and the real reality in the field. And thanks to the booster line that was created several years ago, when we developed the booster line, we actually looked at the database of soil samples that were collected across the island. And based on those findings, that is how you have now within the booster line, you'll find boron, you'll find zinc, and other micronutrients which are critical. So I'm saying this to say that the decision-making process in the formulation of these blends took into consideration what the actual reality is out in the field. Okay. Another critical one out here is calcium. Not a problem in most areas in Jamaica. So even except for those hilly interior areas, a lot of our hilly interior areas suffers, and we can get into that again another time as it relates to the parent material from which the soils were formed. But once you have poor calcium, which is required for the strengthening of the pollen tube and the integrity. So just like I always say, like cement is to a wall, calcium is to the development of the cells of plant and animal tissue. So you'll have poor, without sufficient calcium, you're going to have poor fertilization, and you're going to have fruit abortion that's going to increase in your fields, and you're also going to suffer from food quality decline. And ultimately, all of these together are things that farmers are and should be concerned about and seek to take the necessary steps to prevent them.
Indeed. Melvin, besides nutrition, what environmental factors influence pollen quality?
Okay, so separate and apart from nutrition, environmental factors such as temperature plays a critical role. So if you have very high temperatures, you could very well have a situation where the pollens are formed, but they are sterile, meaning that they are not capable of reproducing. In crops such as tomatoes, sweet pepper, temperatures above 34, 35 degrees Celsius can severely reduce the viability of those pollen grains. Humidity is another one. Excess humidity can cause the pollen grains to clump. So remember we mentioned the hibiscus plant earlier where as kids, if you touch the pollen grains, you'll see them actually coming off on your fingers. Now, in situations where you have high humidity, you're having the clumping of these pollens, and once they clump together, the what you'd call it, the weight of that clump changes. So the ease with it, for example, you would have pollination taking place by wind or by insect. That it becomes a challenge, and as a result of that, you will have serious issues. On the other hand, if you have low humidity, you could have a situation where the pollens are dried out. They become desiccated. And as a result of that, that also affects the viability. So you'll find out that having proper irrigation, timely and adequate irrigation, are some of the factors or steps that will help to alleviate those problems. Water stress is another. Plants suffer moisture stress, that suffers from moisture stress, will definitely have a problem producing adequate flowers. You're going to have fewer flowers, you're going to have poor pollen viability again. So even if they are produced, they're of no real use to you as a farmer in your quest to develop proper fruits. And as a result of that, the incidence of abortion of flowers and fruits, I dare say, become increased. And once those start to happen, then it's a serious concern for our farmers.
All right, so just before we end this conversation, if a farmer wants maximum fruit size and quality, what practical checklist would you recommend?
Okay, so the first of which I made mention just now of the soil test results and what they're showing. You need to have regular soil testing being done. And from there, that's what we do. It's our bread and butter, it's our baby. We'll help you design those nutrient management programs for efficiency. Secondly, you also need to maintain good soil pH, because oftentimes, like we said at the start, there is this emphasis on the application of fertilizer, but fertilizer applied in an environment that is not conducive for the plant to uptake it. And Sajay Jones, our agronomist, looked at that extensively last week on the program. You need to ensure that before flowering, you have adequate phosphorus application. And I say adequate because adequate is not the same as just applying phosphorus without any limit. The truth be told is that excessive phosphorus application can actually impede the uptake of zinc. All right, and we discussed earlier the importance of zinc in the overall process of pollen development. So again, you need to be guided and seek intervention. Zinc, calcium, and boron, we make mention of those to maintain adequate and avoid excessive nitrogen. We have been talking about that for the last couple of months because it is one of those fertilizers that is comparatively cheaper as an input, and as a result there is the abuse, and oftentimes that abuse leads to the downfall of the farmer in terms of how we come out in terms of production. We also need to protect Althea, our pollinator, right? So we need to be sensitive of the time frame in which our pollinators, for example, bees, are most active, and ensure that we're not entering the field, if necessary, to apply pesticide during their peak operating hours. So those are things that if farmers start to pay close attention to those, then you're going to see improvement in your overall performance of your crops.
So just being conscious of what it is that you're doing. And, that is why we need to continue to plug away at the fact that farming is a science. You have to work.
Big
yes, it's big science.
Yeah,
Melvin, always a pleasure speaking with you. Look forward to our next conversation. Thank you so very much.
Always a pleasure.
All right, take care. Melvin Henry, Technical Manager, Newport-Fersan. No pollen, no profit, the science behind fruit size and quality. And this segment of Farm Talk was brought to you by Newport-Fersan, Jamaica.